This paper was published in the Strategic Review in the spring of 1997, and it was called In Defense of Curtis LeMay. And he started out referring to John Lewis Gaddis, who I think many of us have read about, one of the lead Cold War scholars. But Gaddis had written in 1992 that as a result of America's victory in the Cold War, for the first time in over a half a century, no single great power or coalition of powers poses a clear and present danger to the national security of the United States. If history indeed is written by the victors, then future generations of America should read of the righteousness of their country's cause and the courage and sacrifice of their ancestors during the hot and Cold War periods from 1945 to 1991. As one of the victors, General Curtis E. LeMay should thus hold a place of honor in history. Long before LeMay's death, however, historians and pundits alike created from the general's long and distinguished career a two-dimensional caricature, reduced to emerging from his underground command post into the sunlight long enough to bomb him back into the Stone Age type comments before disappearing again to resume his attempts to start a war with Moscow and Beijing. The latest and possibly most thorough attempt to demonize Curtis LeMay emerges in the pages of Richard Rhodes' 1995 book, Dark Sun, The Making of a Hydrogen Bomb. According to the book's jacket blurbs, this Pulitzer Prize-winning author uses the post-Cold War windfall of newly released information in an attempt to tell the secret story of how and why the hydrogen bomb was made. In weaving this tale, Rhodes takes in much of the Cold War landscape. He writes that Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, for example, were Soviet spies and that the Soviet Union developed a carbon copy of the first American atomic bomb, its plans supplied by wholesale Soviet espionage. Yet in the post-Cold War era, revelations such as these are not always the stuff of the bestseller list. Thus, Rhodes takes advantage of what he considers LeMay's already tarnished image to paint a picture of a U.S. military leader and the organization he built, the Strategic Air Command, as the primary threat to mankind, at least through the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. In the end, Rhodes would try to have us believe that we had more to fear from the likes of General Curtis LeMay than from Joseph Stalin or Nikita Khrushchev. One might ask why we should be so concerned about one author's opinion of the late general. After all, Rhodes is not the first to attack Curtis LeMay's reputation. Yet academic and commercial reviews of this book, Dark Sun, hail it as a book of formidable range and a meticulously documented treatise that sets a new standard for its subject matter. Reviewers of Rhodes' books have accepted his portrayal of LeMay uncritically. Paul Lashmer has already repeated Rhodes' treatment of LeMay in the British press, and it will not be long before other researchers are citing the Dark Sun in their own work. Thus, if left unanswered, Rhodes' depiction of LeMay as a warmongering rogue general will continue to gain broader acceptance when repeated by other scholars and researchers otherwise enthralled by Rhodes' weighty study. Curtis LeMay was a far more complex individual than either Rhodes or many other accounts would indicate. Upon his assumption of the post of Chief of Staff of the Air Force in 1961, he had already been in uniform for more than 3 decades. A superb combat leader, he was an outspoken proponent of strategic bombing. As the wartime commander of the 305th Bomb Group in England, he instituted new formations for the B-17s that increased his unit's defensive firepower and enhanced the accuracy of their bombing. His men learned that, however, that LeMay was concerned first and foremost with the safety of those who served under him. He did not merely send men into combat, he shared their risks, leading the 3rd Bombardment Division on the famed shuttle raid to Regensburg in August '43. As a Major General, LeMay took command of the India-based B-29s of the 20th Air Force, 20th Bomber Command, as the U.S. endeavored to bring the home islands of the Japanese Empire under strategic attack. His record and his abilities brought him to the attention of the brass of the Army Air Forces when Brigadier General Haywood Possum Hansel's 21st Bomber Command first appeared to falter in its attacks in Japan. Army Chief of Staff Hap Arnold sent for Curtis LeMay. Following the collapse of Japan, LeMay stayed with the nation's air arm, ready to serve in peace as in war. Greatly disturbed by the Berlin crisis in 1948, the Air Force, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Congress, and President Truman all wanted to strengthen America's deterrent force, the Strategic Air Command. American political and military leaders considered the command in a state of low readiness, poorly prepared to carry out its role in the defense of the U.S. As they did when the strategic campaign against Japan appeared to falter, the Air Force's top leadership, including Chief of Staff Hoyt Vandenberg, turned to Curtis LeMay to set things right. As commanding general of the Strategic Air Command, LeMay did not determine the nation's strategy. As historian David Rosenberg pointed out, LeMay's guidance for post-war nuclear planning was ambiguous, or Truman's guidance for post-war nuclear planning was ambiguous at best. The Atomic Energy Act of '46 gave the president sole authority over the use of the nation's atomic arsenal. Truman conceived of the atomic bomb as an apocalyptic terror weapon of last resort. Still, by the time LeMay took control of SAC, a directive approved by Truman in September 1948, NSC 30, concluded that the military had to be prepared to use atomic weapons and plan accordingly. NSC 30 also kept final approval for the use of the weapons with the Office of the Chief Executive. In November '48, the National Security Council approved a policy of deterrence that emphasized American possession of the atomic bomb. So in order to fulfill SAC's mission, then, General LeMay sought to gain the proper tools for the job of both deterrence and retaliation. Rhodes seeks to frighten the reader by chronicling what he considers LeMay's sinister attempts to take control of America's nuclear stockpile at a time when the bombs legally belonged to the Atomic Energy Commission. Rhodes tells us that in 1950, with war raging in Korea, LeMay sought to arrange with the custodial officer, General Robert Montague at Sandia, for SAC to take possession of the bombs. Say we woke up one morning and there wasn't any Washington, LeMay quipped. I was going to take the bombs. Rhodes does note that LeMay was concerned about a Soviet surprise attack that would decapitate the U.S. government. According to the author, however, Chief of Staff Vandenberg endorsed the general's plan to take the bombs, but told LeMay through a staff officer he saw no reason why the other members of the Joint Chiefs needed to hear about it or approve it. On the basis of this exchange in his book, Rhodes concludes that appropriating the President's authority under the Atomic Energy Act to decide whether and when to transfer atomic weapons to the military was apparently to be exclusively an Air Force prerogative. But then several pages later, Rhodes notes that LeMay and Vandenberg were not alone in their desire to gain military custody of atomic weapons. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, he tells us, had been fighting for custody of those weapons for years. Apparently alarmed, Rhodes informs us that by 1957, the general's last year at SAC as SAC commander, LeMay no longer had to take the bombs, but he had them, and they would not be fitted with the electronic permissive action link locks until early in the Kennedy era. The implications of this statement are clear, considering his personality and what Rhodes thought was his desire to launch a preventive war. SAC's custody of nuclear weapons now meant the only thing restraining the real-life General Jack D. Ripper, in his opinion, from starting a war was his soldier's oath. But what Rhodes omits when he constructs these views is how LeMay and SAC came to get custody over much of the nuclear stockpile by 1957. President Eisenhower had reversed Truman's policy of civilian control of atomic weapons. On June 20th, 1953, the President, responding to a Department of Defense request for custody of the entire stockpile, began the process that by 1961 resulted in more than 90% of the nuclear arsenal falling under military control. As before, however, the chief executive retained sole authority for their employment. I'm going to go on to a reconnaissance issue that historian Cargill Hall has written about recently. Several of us know Cargill. He was an Air Force historian for a number of years and is now chief historian for the National Reconnaissance Office. And Mark Conversino quotes Cargill here. Cargill had written recently that armed with a few interviews and still fewer archival records from the Cold War, authors have produced Oliver Stone-like conspiracies in which LeMay plays a lead role. Cargill Hall notes further that Rhodes, among others, have confused presidentially authorized overflights with related aerial reconnaissance missions that skirted the periphery of the Soviet Union. Beyond that, Hall points out, when overflights did begin in 1951, they were not the rogue operations of Rhodes' imagination. In the wake of China's intervention in the Korean War in late 1950, Truman authorized overflights of the USSR to determine the status of its air forces in those regions of Siberia closest to this country, as well as in the maritime provinces closest to Korea. Through an examination of recently released archival material, Cargill Hall demonstrates that both Truman and Eisenhower approved military overflights between 1951 and 1956. He could find no evidence that LeMay violated any orders by conducting unauthorized missions. Apparently, neither could Rhodes. His endnotes show no evidence that he consulted any primary documents relative to this issue, relying instead on 2 magazine articles as his sources. In addition, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, Rhodes attempted to deliver the coup de grace to LeMay's reputation in Dark Sun's account of that crisis. Curiously, in that, Rhodes does not refer to Soviet actions leading to the Cuban crisis as a provocation of any sort, or indeed one made to order for LeMay's long-standing plans to start World War III. After imparting nothing but benign and defensive motives to Khrushchev's placement of tactical and intermediate-range ballistic missiles in Cuba, Rhodes attempts to demonstrate that the real danger to the U.S. and all mankind was Air Force Chief of Staff Curtis LeMay and his subordinates running SAC. While young President Kennedy sought a sane way out of the crisis, according to Rhodes, LeMay and power sought global war. Rhodes' endeavors to make the American buildup of nuclear and conventional power during the Cuban crisis ominous and fraught with danger. He casts power into a Dr. Strangelove type scene, and he quotes selectively from what he said was the SAC commander's broadcast to his wing commanders made in the clear to make it somehow seem sinister and threatening. And here's a direct quote from General Powers' message made in the clear early in the Cuban crisis. This is General Powers speaking. I am addressing you for the purpose of re-emphasizing the seriousness of the situation the nation faces. We are in an advanced state of readiness to meet any emergencies, and I feel that we are well prepared. I expect each of you to maintain strict security and use calm judgment during this tense period. Our plans are well prepared and are being executed smoothly. Review your plans for further action to be sure there will be no mistakes or confusion. Rhodes characterizes those words of General Powers as a warning to the Soviets. Perhaps it was, after all. If the Soviets were made aware in unmistakable terms of the power arrayed against him, the likelihood of war would hopefully decline. Yet Rhodes again provides an incomplete citation. His source for Sing-Sac's quote is from Scott Sagan's book, The Limits of Safety. But in that book is the entirety of Power's transmission. And the missing lines are that Power also said, if there are any questions concerning instructions which by the nature of the situation deviates from normal, use the telephone for clarification. I expect you, Power continued, to cut out all non-essentials and put yourself in maximum readiness condition if you are not sure of what you should do in any situation, and if time permits, get in touch with us here. Rhodes doesn't find it necessary to note that in his quote. Sagan admitted, as a scholar, to changing his impression of General Power's decision to send this message in the clear when he got to see the full declassified message from which I've just quoted. Sagan wrote he determined that Power's major purpose appears to have been to encourage SAC subordinate officers to place priority on calm judgment and the prevention of mistakes in crises. Such signs of leaders' concern for safety, Professor Sagan concluded, should have a positive impact in reducing the risks of accidents. Virtually all of Rhodes' evidence for the Cuban crisis is drawn from Sagan's book and other secondary sources. The only bit of original material he adds to our understanding of the crisis is a story apparently told to him by an unnamed wing commander. Rhodes informs the reader that B-52 bombers flew beyond their authorized turnaround positive control points, an unambiguous threat which Soviet radar operators would certainly have recognized and reported. This last point may be true enough, provided the bombers flew within range of Soviet radar coverage. However, Sagan and other accounts of the crisis don't make any mention of Khrushchev protesting such flights to President Kennedy. As Rhodes himself notes, Khrushchev lodged a formal complaint with President Kennedy when a U-2 reconnaissance aircraft inadvertently flew over Soviet territory, over Siberia, during the crisis. Would not the approach of several dozen bombers elicit a similar, if not more, alarmed response from the Soviet dictator? In fact, Rhodes provides no corroborating evidence for this assertion. Despite the gravity of charges against General LeMay and SAC during the Cuban crisis, which, according to Rhodes, insubordination, unauthorized provocation, sinister plots to start World War III, Rhodes made no attempt, apparently, to review primary documents relating to this period. He claims in his note on sources that because of SAC's, quote, illegal and nearly fatal operations, unquote, during the crisis, the records are sketchier than his other sources. It's rather curious, then, that Rhodes was unable to make use of the considerable body of primary materials apparently utilized by Professor Sagan in The Limits of Power. In the end, under a section called The Soldier's Oath, what Mark Conversino explored was what Rhodes fails to explain is what restrained LeMay from using the clear provocation of Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba as an excuse to launch his cherished preemptive Sunday punch. With SAC's aircraft loaded and some airborne, it should have been easy for LeMay to start World War III if we are to believe Rhodes' assertion that nothing more than a soldier's oath kept the general on his leash. Yet Rhodes is faced with the inconvenient historical fact that no attack took place. His invocation of LeMay's oath to the Constitution as the only obstacle to the general behaving according to his own personal desires demonstrates not latent insubordination, but an intense sense of loyalty to the Constitution and to the office of President as Commander-in-Chief. Rhodes' attempt to use previously undisclosed sources to finish his case against LeMay falls flat. His story in this case is not new, nor does he use his sources accurately. He tells the reader that neither LeMay nor Power nor anyone in the U.S. government at the time knew that, contrary to contemporary CIA estimates, Soviet forces in Cuba possessed 20 nuclear warheads for their IRBMs. This stunning revelation emerged from a conference between Soviet and U.S. missile crisis participants held in Moscow in 1989. The event was part of a series of 5 meetings held between 1987 and 1992. Scholars working with the Cold War International History Project made excerpts of the transcripts and accompanying evaluations of all conferences available to the general public. Several books chronicling each of these 5 meetings are available. The presence of Soviet nuclear warheads was not the most compelling testimony to emerge from this extraordinary series of gatherings. Rhodes adds an assertion made by former Soviet General Anatoly Rybkov that Moscow had delegated to the Soviet field commander in Cuba, General Plyev, the authority to employ available tactical nuclear weapons in the event of an American invasion. Rhodes thus appears to have final conclusive evidence that if John Kennedy had followed LeMay's advice, history would have forgotten the Nazis and their terrible Holocaust. Ours would have been a historic omnicide. He's obviously more interested in destroying Curtis LeMay's reputation than in illuminating the true nature of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Rhodes doesn't make any mention whatsoever of the often nasty debate that followed in the wake of General Grybkov's statement, omitting, for example, the material released in the fall issue of the Bulletin of the Cold War International History Project, which contained a lively exchange among several historians about the accuracy of General Grybkov's comments. Grybkov subsequently altered his own version of events. At the very least, this open and public exchange should suffice to cast reasonable doubt as to whether Khrushchev or the Soviet defense minister had indeed delegated such authority to General Plyev in Cuba as Rhodes claimed. Surprisingly, after making a great effort to point out the dangers of LeMay having custody of and possibly using nuclear weapons, Rhodes does not seem as concerned that a Soviet field commander could use nuclear weapons on his own initiative. Rhodes selectively uses only that information that would cast both LeMay and the U.S. in the worst possible light. He ignores Fidel Castro's call for a Soviet preemptive strike on the United States. Rhodes appears more concerned with LeMay's personal feelings about a preemptive strike against the USSR than he does about a communist head of state calling for similar action. Furthermore, he fails to consider the ongoing scholarly debate fueled by the newly declassified material that casts doubt onto the assertion that Moscow would have risked the destruction of the USSR for the sake of Castro's revolution. The Curtis LeMay who emerges in the pages of Dark Sun was thus built largely on misrepresentations and myths. Rhodes omits the context in which many of General LeMay's actions took place, blatantly using the general's own words when it suited his thesis, and misusing data and other materials when their proper inclusion into his narrative would call his conclusions into doubt. He strings together the actual events in the context of his narrative to create causal relationships that simply did not exist, such as linking the loss of a Navy reconnaissance aircraft over the Baltic to the SAC commander's covert and extra-legal activities, efforts to carry out provocative penetrations of Soviet airspace. Whatever faults Curtis LeMay may have had as a human being, he deserves a fair hearing in the court of history. Instead, Richard Rhodes has sought to sensationalize a complex and dangerous period of history by destroying LeMay's reputation through the manipulation of evidence. Character assassination, however many books it may sell, has no place in the legitimate study of history. General Curtis LeMay, the men who fought under him, and the nation he served so faithfully and well for nearly 4 decades deserve a better accounting than that provided by Richard Rhodes. are the highlights of Mark Conversino's paper. I do commend to you to read the entire paper, because he constructs a very powerful case, and that is in Strategic Review, which is available in all Air Force libraries and through the Air University, spring 1997 edition. As I say, Mark is continuing some of his research in this field, and I know that we'll be hearing more from him in the future. Yes, sir, General. Please, General.
I had several personal conversations with General LeMay on one of these subjects, because I was going to put something in print, and I wanted to make sure that I had it right, and I read it to him after I wrote it, and he thought about it, and he called me back, and then we changed a few words. Let me give you the essence of it, and it has to do with the firebombing of Tokyo. You remember that the B-50, the B-29s operating out of Tinian, Guam, had a mission that was directed straight from the GHQ, not from the theater commanders. And that mission was, in effect, to destroy the strategic capability of the Japanese islands to support their deployed forces. People at Northwest Field, by and large, had the job of getting the POL. Some of you may have participated in this. They were doing quite well. People under General Power in North Field had the job of getting the munitions industry, and they weren't doing so well. And LeMay was in India. And over there, he watched this happening, and he says, you know, they're not getting to the suppliers in the munitions area, both the ammo builders and the small arms and the machine guns and that sort of stuff. And he talked a lot with General Vinegar Joe Stilwell, who was the commander over there, who disagreed with LeMay completely on what LeMay said he was going to do, that Possum Hansel should do. And that is to bomb that area in northern Yokohama and southern Japan, where almost every house was a little factory, and building bits and pieces for small arms and machine guns and small artillery. Vinegar Joe Stilwell disagreed with this completely, LeMay said, and really took him to the woodshed over this sort of thinking. Break. LeMay goes to Guam. He replaces Possum Hansel. He finds out that they can do reasonably well by downloading the guns, by downloading the canisters, and by heavily loading with firebombs, the B-29s, and he sends them on several missions into northern Yokohama and southern Tokyo, and you know what happened. Almost like a Dresden fire. Devastating, no doubt about it, but it was war. Now, LeMay tells this personally, and I'll try to remember it as exactly as he told me. I was invited to attend the surrender ceremony on board the Missouri in Tokyo Harbor. He said, I flew into Haneda, there in the border between Yokohama and Tokyo, and I took a car and I drove to a disembarkation point to get on to the Missouri in Tokyo Bay. I drove through northern Yokohama and southern Tokyo. Almost every remnant of every house I saw along that whole drive had some sort of drill press, machine tool, or something like that sticking up out of the ruins. And he said, I felt, that I had been vindicated by my judgment to do that, because they were all being used with this bicycle jinrickshaw supply operation to pull things together from all these little sources of supply. He said it made me a little less apprehensive about what we'd done. Not that he was worried about it, but he felt better about it. Then he said, I stood on the deck of the Missouri and we're getting ready for the signing ceremony, and in beside me slipped Stilwell. And Stilwell looked over at me and said, LeMay? Yes, sir. He said, I just drove in from Haneda in a car, and I drove through northern Yokohama and southern Tokyo, and I saw what you had left over there from your firebombing, and by God, LeMay, you were right.
We have a cancellation, created a cancellation for this event. And we decided that in addition to the cancellation that we wanted to use the wonderful artwork that was created by Mike Hagel for use on the envelope that we would use with the cancellation. The cancellation was designed by members of the society, and we have created a cancellation for each day of your event. We have selected to use with this cancellation a commemorative postage stamp that is entitled Honoring Those Who Serve. And it was released for sale in August of last year. The stamp pays tribute to the patriotism and valor of the thousands of dedicated U.S. military veterans who have served their country both here and abroad. And that certainly describes you folks. So thank you. Lieutenant General Smith, on behalf of all of the postal employees in the city of Omaha, for the work that you do, have done with SAC, and still do with the Society and the SAC Museum, please accept this on our behalf and our thanks to you.
Thank you. Thank you.